in the ukulele the ha hey ya 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 the kind sound it can hear this cafe be a show for the young when they say ba khasid in the ukulele ba khasid in the ukulele.
Hello everyone, this is the second in a series of Half the Story, and we said last time that it's absolutely uncanny that we have so many examples where we quote half psukim, half of the verse, when it seems very clear in the Gemara that kol psuke de lo paskinan Moshe, anan lo paskinan. Moshe made it into a verse. We have to always quote it as a verse. So how is it that we quote so many half psukim in our liturgy? So today I'd like to give a few answers that are very what we call localized. Namely, they don't give an ironclad rule to explain many examples. Rather, they go to one example and they explain that example. So let's start with the most known, Friday night. As I said, most Jews start their Kiddush with the words Yom HaShishi or Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voker Yom HaShishi, and do not say the full verse of Vayar Elokim et Kol Asher Asa V'hinei Tov Me'od. Now, just to fill in the picture, I want to say that not everyone was happy with this. For example, the Aruch HaShulchan says V'hinei Tevot Yom Shishi Im Sof Pasuk Vayar Elokim et Kol Asher Asa V'hinei Tov Me'od Vayar Voker Yom HaShishi. Lachain, therefore he says, Yesh nagu lomar belachash, kol pasuk hazeh. Some say quietly the entire pasuk, and they say the words Yom HaShishi out loud. Vehatam, and the reason, kedei shelo tiyeh hatchala be'emtza pasuk v'nachon, so that you don't say half a pasuk, and that's the right way to go. And indeed, that's not just the Aruch HaShulchan's idea. Actually, it's brought in a very interesting place. There is a very, very boyich, fat siddur called the Otzar HaTfilot. Very big siddur with a lot of perushim on davening, and on there, one of the perushim is called Iyun Tefillah. I don't know the author. The Iyun Tefillah says something very interesting. In the earlier years, he believes that people said the whole pasuk, and he has a proof. What's his proof? The first Zemer on Friday night. Those that sing Zmiros know that one of the first Zmiros is called Mekadesh Vi, and in that Zmira it says Tehorim Yirashua v'Yikatshua b'Ma'amar Kol Asher Asa. The pure ones will sanctify it and will ultimately inherit it with the words Kol Asher Asa. The words Kol Asher Asa only appear in the Kiddush if you say the entire verse, Vayar Elokim et Kol Asher Asa. Look in your bencher, it doesn't appear later in the Kiddush. So therefore, he says, we see from this Zemer, that's the way they used to say it. Namely, Tehorim, the pure ones, the Jewish people, Yirashua, they will get the inheritance of Shabbos, Ve'yikatshua, and they will say Kiddush, B'ma'amar, by saying Kol Asher Asa, the entire verse, not half the verse. So, there are those that said, no justification, you should say the whole verse. That's what I personally do. However, the Chasam Sofer, no more and no less, came along and said, my dear friends, you can't say the whole verse. There's a problem. In that famous Gemara that we quoted yesterday in Masechet Megillah, it did say that there is an exception to the rule, and that is what's called lo efshar. Namely, you have no choice. The example in the Gemara was, you're a school teacher. If you always teach an entire pasuk, your students won't understand, especially if they don't understand Hebrew. Imagine trying to keep the pasuk Vayar Elokim et Kol Asher Asa V'hinei Tov Me'od Vayerev Vayivoker Yom HaShishi, and then trying to explain it. They'll get mixed up. So by definition, you have to stop in the middle. So indeed, the Gemara says that Rabbi Chanina went to the big Rav Chanina and tried to ask for a heter. He indeed allowed me to do it in the school class. Why? I got no choice. So says the Chasam Sofer, we have no choice Friday night because there's a medrash. The medrash says that the words V'hinei Tov Me'od, which is at the beginning of that pasuk, means something very negative. What does it mean? It means Tov Me'od Ze Hamavet. Namely, when God created the world, he also created death. We don't want to say the word death right at the beginning of Shabbos. So we have no choice. We have to say half the pasuk. What's interesting is that Rav Soloveitchik, at least the way Rav Shechter says it, basically heard this and laughed. And I quote his words, Rabbeinu siper pam shetamid chacham ech svara la'atir b'zeh. The Gemara Megillah mevurar, sheletzorach gadol yesh la'atir isur zeh. Indeed, the Gemara it says, if there's a great need, you don't have to say the full pasuk. V'hachanami b'leil Shabbat ikatzorach gadol. There is a great need on Friday night. The Midrash Rabbah, in the Medrash it says, Tov me'od ze hamavet, v'tzorach gadol lo la'askir. V'af lo l'rameis. Indeed, we have a great need. We don't want to imply death. We don't even want to say it in a superlative. Lamut ba'atchalat Kiddush, that we want to die at the beginning of Kiddush. And then Rav Shechter writes in parentheses, Vehi hi svarat Chasam Sofer. That's exactly what the Chasam Sofer says. What was Rav Soloveitchik's response? Rabbeinu tzachak mizeh, he laughed. Uma'od lo nichale b'svarazo. He really was not comfortable with this idea. Namely, because there's a medrash somewhere that says this, you won't say the full pasuk. That's not what we call a tzorech gadol. So therefore, Friday night, some people do say half the pasuk, maybe because of the reason of the Chasam Sofer, and others say the full pasuk. Another localized reason, Kiddush-Levana. Kiddush-Levana, we say the words Tipol Alei Mematav Avachad, Bigdol Zaracha Yidmu Kaven, and we don't finish the pasuk. Comes along the Magen Avram and says that's okay. Why? Because at Shirat Hayam, at the singing of this song at the sea, which was the source of those words, that's exactly what the Jewish people did. Moshe Amar Ashir al Hashem, Ve'emar Ashir al Hashem. Namely, it was indeed done in unison and in the middle of a pasuk. Im kain mitchila ne'emar psake psake, ve'lachen ananami amri otakach. So anything that has to do with words from Shirat Hayam, from Az Yashir, you can always split up because that's the way they sang it at the sea. Moshe Rabbeinu said Ashir al Hashem, everyone said Ashir al Hashem. From our perspective, Kiddush-Levana, Moshe Rabbeinu said Tipol Alei Mimatav Afacha Bigdol Zaracha Yidmu Kaven. Then the Jewish people repeated it, and then he completed the pasuk Ad Yavoram Hashem. So therefore, we can do the same thing. Finally, the Rokeach. He wants to understand how is it in Kedusha we say V'karaz el Zeh Amar, we pause, and then everyone says Kadosh, 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 and then the Chazan says Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. How do we pause? It's one pasuk. Same as the Rokeach. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to create a situation where the congregation responds to the Chazan saying, come along and say that God is holy. And the only way to make that impact is to pause and to have everyone chime in. That's exactly why we do it in that manner. And thus he says, when we put back the Torah and we say, Hallelujah, Shem Hashem, praise God, everyone indeed wants to praise God and says, Hodu al eretz v'shamayim. You want to make that impact. In other words, the Chazan says, Hallelujah, Shem Hashem, praise God, and then everyone chimes in and praises God. In other words, it was intentional. We want to create a certain impact in shul where the Chazan instigates us to say something, and everyone then says it. So we found 3 localized reasons for about 4 practices, but our work is still cut out for us.
Uni abudechu ve'atu Adonai, uni keyulechu ve'atu chelkaini.